Hello, good evening. Welcome back to Dusty Feet. It's August 18th, right? 2026. And we're continuing our journey through the scroll of First Kings in our Outside the Class series. So, before we begin, I encourage you to watch the original Bible Project overview video for First Kings. Link to it will be in the description below and, of course, at TheDustyFeet.com. Because that video, it just gives us this wider airplane view, but here we'll slow down. We notice the individual people. We try to see the story, maybe in this journey, from where they stood. At the Dusty Feet, we believe meaningful conversations grow when people have a welcoming place to share, ask questions, listen to one another. There are 4 ways you can connect with us. 1. Visit TheDustyFeet.com. That's our main home for everything that we create. 2. Find us on Substack, where written and spoken reflections give us room to slow down and connect. Link is in the description below. 3. Join us on Facebook at Dusty Feet Journey for comments and discussion. Or 4. You can email me directly at bob@thedustyfeet.com. Wherever you join us, we ask that the conversation remain healthy, respectful, and safe. So, pull up a chair. There's always room for you at the table. So, before we jump in, quick reminder, right? If you find these conversations useful, subscribe. But if you know someone else who may enjoy walking through Scripture the same way that we're doing here, then maybe please like and maybe even share that episode with them. Because here on the Dusty Feet, we try to honor the whole Bible. We try to honor the whole person, right? All the people involved. Because we don't want to reduce someone to one victory, one failure, one difficult season. Because every life is larger than one chapter. And I think that's going to be very important as we walk beside Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. Yeah? Because chapter 18 ended with an extraordinary victory. Yeah? Fire came down from heaven. The people, they fell on their faces and said, Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. And then, after years of drought, the rain returned. So it appeared that maybe everything might change. I mean, perhaps Ahab would repent. Perhaps Jezebel would turn from Baal. I mean, perhaps Israel would return to Yahweh. But it's not what happened, right? Ahab, he runs home, tells Jezebel what Elijah had done, and, well, Jezebel sends Elijah a message, right? By this time tomorrow, she says, his life will be like the lives of the prophets who died at Mount Carmel. So fire fell, the rain returned, the people spoke the right words, but Jezebel is still Jezebel. And Elijah, he runs. So Elijah sets off and he travels south. He goes to Beersheba. And then he stops there and he leaves his servant in Beersheba and then he wanders, he walks another day into the wilderness. And he stops, sits beneath the broom tree, and then he asks God to just let him die. He said, it's enough, right? Now, Yahweh, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. These are not the words that we probably expect from the Elijah of Mount Carmel, because yesterday he stood before a king, the prophets of Baal, the entire people of Israel. And now he's sitting alone beneath a tree and says, it's enough. But this is still Elijah, right? That man beneath the broom tree, he's not a different person from the prophet on the mountain. Both moments definitely belong in his story because he can be brave and afraid, can be faithful, still exhausted, right? He can be certain in one moment and then unable to see the road ahead of him in that next. Real people carry all of those things. Because remember, so can we. So he asks to die. And yet, the text does not shame him, right? God does not arrive with a lecture. Elijah lies down, goes to sleep. And then a messenger touches him, right? He wakes him up and says, "Get up and eat." And Elijah finds sitting there bread, right, baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he eats, he drinks, and he lies down again. Messenger returns a second time. And again, he touches Elijah and then he says, "Get up and eat." And then he adds, "Or the journey will be too much for you." So I find those words compassionate, right? Not "you're too weak," not "you failed," just "or the journey," right, that he does not know of yet, right, will be too much for him. God sees Elijah's limits. God knows Elijah's at his wit's end. He sees someone who just needs food, water, sleep, gentle care, right? Before God gives Elijah a new assignment, he lets him rest. Like before God addresses Elijah's view of the story, right? He cares for Elijah's body first. I guess maybe sometimes we offer a lesson when someone just needs a meal, right? We reach for an explanation when someone just first needs rest. But God doesn't treat Elijah as a problem to solve. He does just end up caring for him as a whole person. And then now, strengthened by the food and rest, Elijah gets up and he continues this travel into the wilderness for 40 days, 40 nights, right? And he reaches Mount Horeb, that mountain of God, right? Horeb, that's another name for, Sinai. That mountain, where Moses met God, the mountain of the covenant. Quick left turn for a moment. Because I think there's a red string connection here that maybe might be worth exploring quickly, right? Moses had stood on this mountain, right? He spent 40 days and 40 nights with Yahweh as Israel's covenant was being formed and then renewed. And now Elijah, he travels 40 days and 40 nights to the same mountain during another covenant crisis. And then centuries later, right, Yeshua's going to spend 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his public ministry. Yes, they are not identical experiences. Moses receives the words of the covenant. Elijah arrives tired, afraid, and in need of a new direction. And Yeshua, well, he's tested in the wilderness and he just remains obedient and faithful. Yet all three pass through a season of 40. Each moves through a wilderness story. And for all three, right, those 40 days, they're not the end. There's still more road ahead. Moses returns to Israel. Elijah is going to return with a a new assignment, and soon a new companion. And Yeshua, he leaves the wilderness and begins announcing God's kingdom. And yet, then later in Yeshua's story, these three same men, right? Both Moses and Elijah, they stand with Yeshua on another mountain. Because here Luke is telling us they're speaking about the departure of Yeshua. And the word that Luke uses is exodos, right? They speak about his exodus. Moses led Israel's exodus. Elijah, he's calling Israel back to the covenant formed through that exodus. In Yeshua, he's preparing to walk through the suffering and death toward resurrection and life, kingdom life after the exodus. Something to ponder. Okay, back to the mountain. At Horeb, Elijah enters a cave, spends the night. And then Yahweh comes to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? God knows why Elijah's there. The question merely gives Elijah now room to speak, right? And then Elijah does, right? He says, I have been very zealous for Yahweh. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets. I alone am left. They are seeking my life. His words contain some truth. Israel has broken the covenant. Prophets have been killed. Jezebel is seeking his life. But his words, they're not the whole truth. They're not the whole story. Because Elijah says, I alone am left. And yet, remember chapter 18, when we met Obadiah? Obadiah had hidden 100 prophets of Yahweh, and he kept them alive. Fear and exhaustion may have narrowed what Elijah could see. Pain has a way of doing that. And it doesn't make the pain false, right? It just makes the visible world feel smaller. Because Elijah, he can see Jezebel, he can see the danger, he can see the broken altars, but he cannot yet see the faithful people, maybe that God has preserved. So God tells Elijah to stand on the mountain. Powerful wind roars up and tears through the rocks. But Yahweh's not in the wind. And comes an earthquake. Yahweh's not in the earthquake. After the earthquake comes fire. Yahweh's not in the fire. And then comes what translations describe as a gentle whisper, a low voice, the sound of thin silence. It's something quiet, something Elijah must pause to hear. And when Elijah hears it, wraps his face in a mantle, goes and stands at the entrance to the cave. In that previous chapter, God had answered him with fire, but here, this person, in this moment, God meets Elijah in the quiet. This is the God who sends fire from heaven, right? He can also speak without overwhelming this very weary prophet. It seems like God's care actually just fits the moment. Because then the question comes again. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah, he gives the same answer. Even after hearing the quiet voice, he still feels alone. You know, healing does not always happen in one dramatic moment, right? Sometimes Sometimes people just need to tell their story more than once. Yeah. And that God does not reject Elijah for repeating himself. Instead, he begins to widen Elijah's view, right? God gives Elijah new work. He is to appoint Hazael the king over Aram, right? Jehu is king over Israel, and Elisha is going to be the prophet who's going to follow him. Now we know some of those choices are going to bring some difficult results later on in the story. And of course, the Scroll of Kings hasn't and continued to not hide those kind of things. But this one thing is already becoming clear. God's work does not depend upon Elijah alone. There are people that he hasn't met yet. There are parts of God's work moving beyond what Elijah can see. Because then God tells him that 7,000 people remain in Israel who have not yet bowed to Baal. Remember, Elijah said, I alone am left. God tells him there are 7,000 you just can't see. God doesn't deny his danger or his pain. Those are real. But they're not the only truths in the story, right? Faithfulness still exists beyond what Elijah can see. In the story, it's larger than the part that he perceives, right? This future does not rest upon this one exhausted person. So then Elijah gets up. He leaves Horeb, and then he goes and he wanders and he finds Elisha plowing a field with his oxen, right? Elisha's just working through an ordinary day, right? He does not know that this prophet is about to walk into his life. He's going to walk into his biblical story. So Elijah passes by, throws his mantle over him. Elisha, he understands the invitation, right? And he goes, he runs, he says goodbye to his mom and dad, right? He says bye, honors his mother and father. And then he slaughters those oxen, uses the wood and the yoke and the harnesses for fire, and he shares the meat with the people, his neighbors. And he follows Elijah. So the man who felt completely alone now has someone to walk beside him. Because Elisha needs to and will learn from Elijah. He will serve with him. And then one day he's going to continue the work after him. Because not only does God give Elijah another task, he gives him another person. Maybe sometimes that next step is just not a larger platform, right? Sometimes it's companionship. It's companionship along that weary road of life. When we place chapters 18 and 19 beside each other, there's contrast there that's interesting. In chapter 18, right, Elijah stands before the crowd, and in chapter 19, he sits alone beneath a tree. In chapter 18, God's fire falls from heaven. Chapter 19, God meets him in the quiet. In chapter 18, Elijah restores the altar. And in chapter 19, God begins restoring Elijah. We need both chapters. Because if we read only chapter 18, right, Elijah may become this untouchable hero. But if we read only chapter 19, then he may just become a tired prophet who lost his way. The whole story gives us the whole person, right? Elijah is neither only his victory nor only his collapse. He is a faithful and limited human being shaped by a patient, loving God. And truly, not too unlike ourselves. So as we leave chapter 19, Elijah's story's not finished, right? He's going to still speak. He will still confront kings. He will still serve Yahweh. But now he knows he's not the only faithful person left. He's heard God in the quiet. He's received food when he could not continue. And now another traveler has joined him on the road. Elijah couldn't see the mountain in the distance under that broom tree. Then, of course, he couldn't see Moses. He couldn't see Yeshua or the conversation about the coming Exodus so many centuries later. For him, he could only see the road in front of him. Still Elijah, still human, still being formed. He's still part of a larger story that's just so much bigger than he could see. So maybe this week, return to 1 Kings 19. Read it slowly, right? Sit beneath the broom tree. Notice what God does before he offers direction. Walk with Elijah toward Horeb, right? Listen to the wind. Feel the ground shake. Watch the fire. Wait for the quiet. And then notice that God does not reduce Elijah to just his one painful day, right? He feeds him. God listens. God widens his view. God gives him someone to walk beside him. Read the whole Bible. Honor the whole person. And remember that every life that we walk beside today is still being written. So until next time, keep wandering with dusty feet. Because sometimes when the journey becomes too much, God just meets us with bread, rest, a quiet voice. And sometimes the chapter that we think may be our ending actually just becomes another step, maybe just towards a mountain that we cannot see. Thank you for meeting with us tonight on the Dusty Feet. Shalom, shalom.